Welcome back, everybody, to Constructive Uncoupling. I'm Judy Weigel, your amicable divorce expert. Why? Because that's all I do, amicable divorces. Today, we have a wonderful guest with us. Her name is Lee Miller. Lee started out as an attorney, became a mediator, then became a therapist. Her background is amazing. Her training is in Masters of Arts in Clinical Psychology, advanced training in suicide prevention counseling, training in child custody mediation, which is going to be specific in part to this discussion today, a part of the Advanced Family and Divorce Conflict Resolution for Collaborative Professionals. She has domestic violence training for child custody evaluators, trained in child and adolescent psychopharmacology. She is an instructor for Family Connections program for the National Education Alliance for Borderline Personality Disorder. She has family-to-family education with the National Association for the Mentally Ill. And lastly, she's a former board member for Friends of the Semel Institute of Neuroscience and Human Behavior at UCLA. Lee works in Los Angeles, which is where I work. My company, as you may know from listening to other episodes, is Divorce Resource Incorporated in Los Angeles, where I am a divorce mediator, and I also file for amicable divorces. But when you get to know Lee, and you get to be on her mailing list, you get to have monthly articles on an array of topics on divorce that are helpful to everyone, amicable and not amicable. And regardless of your specific involvement in divorce, we all know somebody who is getting divorced or about to get divorced, and anyone going through divorce, especially with minor children, needs to know Lee. And the reason why I wanted to interview Lee now is a result of receiving 2 emails from her recently. One is about mental illness and how mental illness can be pervasive in your life. And the other is about children in divorce. Now, I use that preposition in, not of. Children are in divorce just like their parents are in divorce. And that really should be notated by anybody going through divorce with minor children. So I thought to combine these topics for today because one of the scariest situations imaginable is co-parenting with a mentally ill spouse. Welcome, Lee. We need your help.
Thank you, Judith. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, to quote your most recent email, mental illness has increasingly become more in the forefront of our culture conversation. And in my world of amicable divorce, I have been dealing with personality disorders in my clients, which are a form of mental health challenges, and that's been going on for some years. So first, could you, for our audience, please tell us what mental illness is?
Yes, mental illness is a wide range of mental health conditions, or more accurately stated, mental health disorders that affect your mood, your thinking, and your behavior. These conditions include things like mood disorders, which people know in the examples of depression, anxiety, and also personality disorders, which most commonly you hear people talk about things like narcissistic personality disorder.
That's right. That's the big word now, isn't it? Narcissism. It used to be bipolar.
Yes.
So what are the 4 personality disorders?
So actually there are
more?
Yeah, there are more than 4. There are actually 10 personality disorders.
What are the top ones that people know and run into?
The top ones really are narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, anxious or fearful personality disorder. Are some of them. They're actually set up in 3 clusters. They're known to the mental health profession as Cluster A, Cluster B, and Cluster C. And they are differentiated by the type of behaviors and symptoms that each disorder would be exhibiting.
Okay, now, personality disorders are part of the mental health challenges that we have. And what are the so that's that. What are the emotional challenges that impact mental health when going through a divorce?
The emotional challenges really arise because in any stressful event, emotion will be triggered. And if there is a propensity for a particular type of behavior, as you would find in a personality disordered person, any stressful event is going to trigger the emotional response that they are typically likely to exhibit, except that it will be exonerated by the amplified, rather.
By the fear.
Right?
Yes.
By the fear. Because what happens in stressful situations is that our brains and bodies become flooded with chemicals and hormones that create a flight or fight response so that we can manage the conditions of the feared event. And so what happens is when we are flooded by these chemicals and hormones, our cognitive functioning actually shuts down. And what happens is we can't think very clearly. We don't feel comfortable physically because it secretes adrenaline, which makes us feel edgy and kind of panicked. And so we can't regulate. We can't self-regulate, which, if you think about it, in a situation like divorce, the primary tools that you will need for a satisfactory outcome are self-regulation.
That's right.
Are self-regulation and the ability to think clearly.
So what should people do when they're going through divorce and they know, well, hopefully they're aware that they do have a mental health challenge? What do they do to help themselves? And then how should their spouse react and respond to this?
First and foremost, I think it is really critical for the partner of the mentally ill person to become educated in the condition that the mentally ill person is suffering from. The more information you have, the more you know about what is going on with that person, the easier it's going to be for you to navigate through this stressful event and relationship after this event. So education, I think, is first and foremost. For example, narcissists are highly reactive. They react contrary to any viewpoints that they don't agree with. They will usually do so with anger and with rage. They love drama. Okay, so when you're dealing with a narcissist, if you know this, right, you're going to be able to establish a form of behavior yourself as you interact with that person that's going to minimize the trigger for these behaviors.
Is flattery a tool that a spouse can use on the narcissistic spouse? And as weird as that may be, my understanding of narcissism, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's an inferiority core to it. And therefore, the narcissist always needs to shed light on themselves. They need to be complimented. They need to be supported so the fear doesn't overtake them. So can a spouse, what kind of tools like that can a spouse use?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We say flattery. Another form of flattery would be to empathize, to acknowledge, right? To listen so that the person who has a grandiose sense of self feels important enough so that
to at least be softened and open to having some type of compromise, which we know compromise is not a good word with narcissists, right?
No, because they don't really understand how to compromise.
Yeah, so do we have to bring them to a place where they kind of see what's in it for them to meet us halfway or meet us part of the way?
Yes, and to a place where they feel secure enough and validated enough to get what they think they want, right? As long as a narcissist feels like he or she is winning, in air quotes, in some way, they're going to be much more amicable to negotiation.
Excellent.
So, yeah, so you want to be sure that you're managing your own reactivity, right? When you're dealing with a narcissist, you want to act, not react.
Yes, and the other thing is blame. This is something that I'm not a therapist, I'm a mediator, but I touch a little, I touch the emotions of people on a daily basis. And my mantra with everybody is when you can get yourself to a place of not blaming your spouse, you can now see a path forward. And so can we speak for a moment about whether it's narcissism or any other type of mental health challenge? Just the exercise of not blaming is so important, isn't it?
Oh, I agree completely. It's absolutely essential if you're going to get to agreement. And it's particularly important as we're talking about the mental health impact on this kind of stressful event, because somebody with borderline personality disorder is somebody who has an extra difficulty with taking responsibility. So if you take it personally when you are blamed by that person, you would not be taking into account that person's struggle, and you're going to run into a problem. So understanding, that blame doesn't go anywhere except backwards, right? Most times You're being blamed for something in the past, right?
Yes.
If the goal here is to move forward, then blame is a vehicle that's going to seriously obstruct that goal.
So maybe we could take a step back just for a second before we launch into co-parenting with somebody with mental health conditions. Where do the personality disorders come from?
So personality disorders are usually diagnosed or identified earlier in life, often during early adolescence and sometimes even earlier than that. The difference between mood disorders and personality disorders is that mood disorders will come and go. It's a chronic condition. Personality disorders are rigid patterns that exist all the time. They are there all the time. They're rigid patterns of behavior.
Can they change? Even with awareness, of the person who has them, can they change?
Yes, they're more difficult to change and much more difficult to treat than, say, a mood disorder. But
mood disorder would be with maybe some
bipolar disorder, or yes. Oh, you mean the treatment of?
Yeah.
Yes.
Along with therapy, but there are drugs for that. But for personality disorders, there probably aren't, are there?
There are some specific modalities that can be used for personality disorders. For example, they've had a lot of success treating borderline personality disorder with something called cognitive dialectical behavioral therapy.
Lee, what is borderline?
So people with borderline are impulsive. The behaviors that you will see with somebody who's suffering from borderline personality disorder is impulsivity. You will see that person have intense anger, intense depression, intense anxiety. You will notice that that person will feel or perceive, even when it's not there, a deep sense of abandonment in many, many situations that wouldn't ordinarily warrant a person feeling abandoned. Okay. They think in very black and white terms. A person with borderline personality really struggles with gray. It's this or that. Okay. In divorce situations, that can be very challenging because particularly if you're doing a mediated divorce, most of what you're trying to get to is the gray.
Yes,
yes,
that's true.
So a person with that issue, with that struggle, is going to really be challenged by constantly being pushed into the gray areas.
So what do we do?
We acknowledge that, we recognize the limitation, and we try to reframe in a way that somebody who's more likely to see it in black and white terms might be able to see it. So That's what we do,
Okay, now let's move into divorcing somebody with some type of personality disorder. And we could talk all day about it, but I wanted to focus on children, co-parenting children with a spouse that has a mental health challenge. Where do you start?
It's very, very challenging. It's a very challenging situation. And I think some of what we've already discussed is relevant because where you start is with education. So the biggest question that's going to come up when you're bringing children into the mix is, what do you tell your children? How do you explain all this craziness to, and I'm putting craziness in quotes because who knows what normal is, but...
Thank you for saying that is true.
Yeah, but what might appear to be crazy behavior, how do you explain that to children? My personal belief and my professional experience has taught me that parents need to tell their children in age-appropriate doses about mental illness and about the effects that mental illness may be having on the other parent. The problem is you don't want to overshare, right? You don't want to overshare because children don't need too much information to feel safe and satisfied. They really just need very concrete explanations. That's how children think, in very concrete terms. So you don't want to overshare, but at the same time, you don't want to gaslight your children about something that's really obvious because they know what they see. So it's a fine line. And I think the answer is to, if you need help, get help. Consistently remind your children that the purpose and the goal of everything that you and the other parent are doing is to ensure safety for them and for the family, because that's something children understand and are definitely reassured by.
So safety is really important because I would expect the greatest fear of any parent is to allow their child to go with an adult that may not be able to make the best decisions for them and impair their safety and their health. So you have two parents in mediation, and you recognize that one parent has some mental health challenges, and you're working on a co-parenting plan. What are some of the ways you consider helping them develop a plan with the safety of their children first, i.e. overnights versus no overnights, driving in a car versus not driving? I mean, these are safety risks, right?
Yes, those are safety risks. You're exactly right. And they have to be considered in a very, very customized way when you're dealing with each issue and the particular mental illness that's present in the room, because it might be different for a different kind of mental illness. So you want to be pretty specific about where the danger is. And I think that there are two different scenarios. One is where the person who has the mental illness acknowledges the mental illness and comes to the table with that awareness.
Now you can work with this person, right? And build in safety nets.
There you are. Exactly. Okay. Exactly. I think the bigger challenge is when there isn't that acknowledgement. And in those cases, it will sometimes become necessary to pull in an outside resource, possibly to do an evaluation, to do a reality check, so that it's not just the spouse who's calling for additional safety measures, but some other professional who has some insight.
How do you get that person to even agree to undergo an evaluation?
It's difficult, but I think that given I'm speaking now in the context of mediation or a mutual agreement between the partners to go through the divorce process. There is a mutual goal to get it done. There is a mutual goal to get through this process in the most peaceful, amicable way and have the best possible outcome at the end of it. And so using that part of the person who has the mental illness to motivate them to get that goal accomplished.
Motivate them, like explain that you want them to be part of the children's lives, but in a way that is constructive and healthy for both.
Correct.
And not want to give that spouse more than they can take. Okay, so now we have this other issue that you listen to, I'm sure, like I do, and that is, well, I want 50-50 time because the backdrop to that is money. It influences child support. So how do we deal with getting the person with the mental health challenges to do step-up plans, so to speak? Take it small now. You're on your own as a parent. I mean, that's a big deal, right? They're on their own now.
Yes.
I haven't even thought about that aspect. Acknowledge that it's going to be a little different for both parents because they're on their own. They're not in the same house. They're not sharing duties. And the reality of being on your own as a parent, if you're not used to it. So there's a step-up plan, right, isn't there?
Exactly. And that is the best answer to the problem. Because what it does is it gives everybody a chance to make the adjustment that they have to make.
Say what step-up plans are. Explain.
A step-up plan is a plan that allows you to change the parenting plan over a period of time, increasing usually the increments of time and responsibility by each parent.
And what people probably don't think of when they're going through the divorce and creating the co-parenting plan is, especially if the children are still young, well, we're doing what we have to do for the settlement agreement. But this is organically going to change anyway. Forget any mental health challenges. As the children get older, they will then be more proactive about saying who they want to be with, probably.
Yes, exactly. And I think your point is so important because a parenting plan is not a document that is set in stone. You know, it's a back wall, it's a fallback for parents who cannot agree on the day-to-day changes that will inevitably occur. The family is changing, the children are changing. You're not going to be able to predict for every single set of circumstance when you're sitting in a room today and drafting your parenting plan. So I think that understanding of the fact that this is an organic document, I really like the word that you used for that. It's an organic document that reflects the organic lifestyle of this family as it progresses in time.
In terms of going back to the parent, oh, wait a minute. I was going to say going back to the parent with mental health challenges, what if you have two parents with mental health challenges and they're sitting in front of you? Lee, what do you do? What are your obligations as a therapist and then maybe as a mediator?
Well, I'll say this. The first thing you do is you take a very deep breath and you steady yourself because your best tool is going to be your own self-regulation. As the mediator in the room, you're going to need to be you always need to be, but particularly in these circumstances, more aware and more centered and more careful. And you might have to work a little slower to ensure that you're not saying or doing something that might trigger either one of them. The needs are going to be different. So I think as a mediator, that's going to be part of your preparatory work, is to understand the disorders that you're dealing with and to prepare for what the needs of each of these two parties might be that would be different than a couple sitting in front of you who aren't struggling with mental illness.
Okay. As either a therapist or a mediator, Lee, and a mediator with therapist background, what if you think that one parent, just by the way they've spoken, by the expressing what they think good parenting is, what if you think this would be the most disastrous thing for a child? What do you do?
Often what I'll do in that situation is I will caucus, which is a mechanism that we can use in mediation where we separate the parents and I get a chance to talk to one parent alone for a little while. And when I'm faced with what you've just described, I have found that to be a very useful vehicle because I can do a little one-on-one time with the parent who I think is misguided in their parenting approach. And I can share with them some information without shaming them that might help them understand a better way to do it without making them feel embarrassed or ashamed that the way they think they should have been doing it was wrong. I can offer different options, different solutions. I can use some studies that I have on hand at almost every mediation to share with them some evidentiary information that might help them understand there's a better option.
And you said something so very important that I watch more often than I would like in a mediation, and that is one parent or one spouse shaming the other person, thinking either this is the better way to do it, you have a third person in the room, now you're really going to expose this person. And in my opinion, all they're doing is making that person defensive and fearful, and you're not really accomplishing anything positive.
That's exactly right, Judith. That's exactly right, and you've described it perfectly, because that is exactly what happens. And shame is the most challenging of emotions to be dealing with when you're in a room with your spouse, but worse when you're in a room with a stranger.
Yes, because doesn't shame prevent you from being honest about yourself and really talking about what your challenges are so that you can get help?
Exactly. That's exactly what it does.
Shame is really powerful.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the biggest challenges for co-parents in general is communication about the children. So it's the piece of the divorce that keeps on giving. You will always be a family connected by your children. You just won't be married spouses, right? So let's talk about communication and co-parenting, even if we don't have mental health challenges. But we didn't really have great communication skills during the marriage. Do you work on communication skills with co-parents as a part of the instruction or work going forward?
Yes, absolutely. That is a huge part of both the mediation process and the co-parenting counseling, which in my opinion should be happening before, during, and after the process.
Thank you for saying that. I meant to bring that up. Keep going.
Yes, because we do know this. We know that when studies have been done to test the functionality of children in and after divorce, there has been very, very clear evidence that shows that there is a direct correlation between the level of conflict between the parents and the level of functionality of the children. So the higher the level of conflict between the parents, the lower the level of functionality in the children. So we know this. There's countless studies that have completely reinforced this finding. So communication is probably the most central factor that can impact the level of conflict between the parents. Therefore, the most single factor that will influence the level of functioning of the children.
How do we change the communication? How do you change the communication?
You know, I think we are not taught mostly in our families and really even in our schools how to communicate, and particularly not how to communicate in conflict. So part of it is education, right? We have to educate on communication, and there are several communication models that can be used that you can teach during the course of a mediation or in co-parenting counseling over a period of time that really have a very powerful impact and that aren't that hard to learn.
Like key phrases, key approaches?
Key phrases, key approaches. For example, speaking with I statements rather than you statements is an important communication tool. Being able to rephrase your question, your statement, as a request. Because what that does is it makes it clearer to the listener as to what their role in the conversation is. By asking a question or making a request, you're defining the role of the listener so that they know they're being asked to respond to this particular question or this particular request, as opposed to making a statement which leaves the listener confused about what they're supposed to do with the information that they've just received.
How do you change? See, for me, there had to have been a communication pattern that went awry in the marriage. So great if you don't have kids, we don't have to talk to each other anymore. But if we have children, we have to continue to talk. So I think we can all see when people come in our offices what their communication pattern is a little bit. Do you identify harmful, what they may be doing unintentionally, harmfully, and then help them rephrase, restate, help give them a different way of approaching their communication? So the I position, instead of saying, you makes people protective,
Correct.
Defensive.
Yes.
And therefore they feel that they have to go into defense mode.
Yes.
And so when you say it's just a request you're making from you. It doesn't carry with it a blame.
Correct.
tool.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Most people hear the word you as an accusation.
Yes.
And if you feel
Nicely
like you're
said.
being accused of something,
Yes.
you're going to need to defend yourself.
Okay, so text versus picking up the phone and talking. What do you think? I know not the one way doesn't work for everybody, but I think I'm going to scream if I listen to more people say, but I texted. Well, if you're not getting a good result in text, can you pick up the phone? Will that work? What do you think? How do you deal with this?
I agree with you completely. I think that texting is a really dangerous mode of communication. Honestly, I understand the need for it. I recognize the benefit of the urgency in request and response that you get from it. But you cannot read tone. You cannot read meaning. You cannot really make accurate interpretations. So when I'm doing a mediation or co-parenting counseling, I strongly recommend that parents use texting only for scheduling, and that no communication should ever, and particularly not text, contain emotional expression.
Like exclamation points in capital letters.
Just like that, yes. And ramblings about why do you always do this, or why haven't I heard back from you? Questions like that, which only incite and provoke, will
Yes.
not get an answer that's going to take you forward in the issue you're trying to resolve.
What does My Family Wizard do? For those who haven't heard of it.
Yeah, so there are some monitored parental control applications that you can use as co-parents, which will give you an opportunity to have, if you choose, a third person monitoring your conversations, or alternatively, an ability to understand and know that if you were ever to come to court, if you were ever to end up in a situation where your communications were relevant to a decision that a court would have to make, letters and communications that you've shared through vehicles like Our Family Wizard are admissible in court. So you can be monitored by a third person in real time, and it's also a record, which ultimately can be used, to help resolve a situation if you ever need to do that in a court of law. And there are many of these applications, and they're very useful. I like them, and I suggest them, particularly in high conflict cases.
Yes. Where I guess there are just some people that cannot speak, period, with any amount of help. They just can't.
Yes, I agree. And I think that in addition and as supplemental tools for the apps, I recommend that the therapist or the mediator or the coach make certain to help the couple learn how to write without emotional language, how to make a request without emotional language, and how to respond to a request without emotional language.
Okay, that's excellent. That's really excellent. And maybe just to finish this part, the spouse, if you have one spouse with communication, worse communication issues than the other spouse or the mental health challenge and the other spouse doesn't, I guess it would be incumbent upon the spouse who doesn't have mental health challenges to just have to be the one that leads the good communication, that is steadfast, that is understanding, because somebody has to be with the kids, for the kids' sake, right?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And your point really is even broader, I think, in the sense that this is a family restructuring. This is a family trying to find a better way than how they've lived in the past. And so every person's strength and skill that they can bring to that process is going to help determine a better outcome.
That was so well said. That was excellent to end this episode. Lee, how do people get in touch with you?
They can reach me by phone, by email, or through my website.
Tell us what
my phone number is 310-614-0323. My website is www.leemillertherapist.com.
Do them both again.
310-614-0323 or www.leemillertherapist.com.
I really appreciate you took the time to come here and talk to all of us. This was very beneficial. Thank you, Lee. And thank you all for listening to Constructive Uncoupling. This is Judy Weigel. You can reach me at my company, Divorce Resource Incorporated in Los Angeles. My phone number is 310-441-7555, 310-441-7555, or Judy at divorceresourceinc.com. Thank you so much. We will be back.